Hello. Hey, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Yeah, happy St. Patrick's Day if you're watching this live. Um, didn't theme the program to be St. Patrick's Day this year. Didn't think about that, but still, happy St. Patrick's Day to all of you watching here. We're gonna get started in just a couple minutes here, as always. If you're watching live, just hang out for a couple minutes. I'm gonna tell you about some stuff coming up. And if you're watching after the fact, the recording, you feel free to skip ahead a minute or two, and that'll get you to the program. Yeah. I'm Ben Clark. I don't always say that, by the way.
I'm not
But
sure I understand.
oh, thanks, Siri. Whoops. Let me turn that off. Um, Hey, yeah, I'm Ben Clark, by the way. I don't always introduce myself, but archivist historian here, and I'm going to be telling you about the program today. But yeah, in the meantime, I suppose I can tell you about some stuff that's coming up. So today we're going to be talking about a map. We are in the midst of March MAPness, which is our theme for this month. Um, let's see, did I put the thing up? Nope, still didn't. That's from last month. Okay. Well, anyway, next week we're going to be continuing this theme too. Today we're talking about a school district map, but next week we're going to be talking about topographical maps. So Gary Gisselman will be back, and he'll be taking a look at maps that at least in theory, I think are probably more at least understood. Topographical. You can see the lines showing how high or low you are, and he'll take a look at that, show what makes us distinct through those maps. So we're going to be continuing that. We've got 2 weeks left after this week here today of March MAPness. So there's some fun stuff coming up with that. As for our History Speaks series, we are continuing that. The next one will be on April 2nd in 2022 here. That's a Saturday at 2 p.m. And we're going to be doing having a guest speaker, Paul Clark from the Wausau East High School History Department. And he's going to be telling us all about a man of principles, William Jennings Bryan in Wausau. William Jennings Bryan being, if you don't know the name, you do know things that are legacy from him. He's one of these guys that was very involved in a lot of different areas in American history and ended up having a big impact. And so Paul's going to tell us about him as the man, and also about his trips to Wausau, as far as we know. So that's coming up. Well, today, and I think I can take that off. I think we got that pretty good. Yeah. So today we're talking about a different type of map. Again, March MAPness is what we're doing today, this month, I guess. So we're looking at maps and understanding what stories they tell and about them. So, for example, next week we're talking about topographical maps, of which there are, they're not necessarily the same. They're produced by a specific entity, a government body, or a surveyor, or what have you. And then, you can compare them. I don't know that topographical maps will change very much. But for example, the one we did at the beginning of this month, where we talked about the county borders, well, if you compare maps over the years, you can see how they change. Today we're talking about something a little different, which is this map here. This is a map in our collection. I'm going to actually bring up the scan here. This is in Photoshop Elements, because that's what I have here. This is the map. I cropped it for the presentation here, but this is the edges. As you can see, there's some damage to this particular map that's been taped up. It's on a piece of poster board, or not sure, cardstock of some sort. And as you can see, it has been cropped. This is not me cropping it. This has been cut so that it would fit in a box. But it was mounted on this for display, I'm assuming, here at the Historical Society at some point. There are some other explanations for this, and we'll maybe talk about that at the end. I think I know there's one of two reasons that this was created. It's not, as you might expect, like a lot of maps, created for the purpose in this time. So this is from the school districts in 1948. And as this shows you, it's actually on a map that was produced in 1943. This is a sectional highway map. So here's a blank version of it. So basically it has all of the sections in each of the municipalities, with all the roads and highways so that you could kind of find your way around. But somebody took that map and added some new stuff to it. They added the school district boundaries and labeled them. So, for example, if we look at town of Johnson here, we don't talk about Johnson very much. Well, maybe we'll just talk about kind of focus in here. There are 5 school districts that they maintain. One down here, one over here, 3, 4, 5. Milan here. Sorry, Milan, however we pronounce it. And then there's also, right here, there's a joint school district with number 3, which is in conjunction with the town of Bern. I'm guessing this means that it's over in Taylor County as well. School districts don't necessarily conform to the county. Sometimes, it's easier just to send kids to a schoolhouse just over the border where there's, something else. So, yeah. And then, of course, it's been colored in. So, okay, where was this created for? It was at some point added to the Historical Society. The number that we have, the accession number, the ID number that we have, is actually what we call a found in collection number. It's a number that says when you look up, what it actually has in the record book. It just, who donated and that sort of stuff and when. It's usually what you would find in there. But this is a found in collection. This is one that we just came across and went, uh-oh, why doesn't this have a number? Well, it's been here for a while. We'll just give it a new number. The other alternative thing is sometimes if it's something we create, like if in the 1960s, 70s, Ed Schoenberger, during his tenure, it does have a very Schoenbergian sort of feel to it, using colored pencils to illustrate something. Although I don't think he would have necessarily, or people at that point would have gone through and, created this level of detail for something that happened 20, 30 years earlier. So, but whoever was using it, they had it donated to them. Maybe we created it. Either way, it was used in an exhibit of some sort. And you can see here, there's some information on the bottom where they say that there are, in 1948, 212 school districts in Marathon County, which is a lot. And then those districts operated 224 one-room schoolhouses in the county. This is also kind of makes me think that this wasn't created for the exhibit, or at the time, I should say, because it says operated. But again, there's levels here, right? So you have the original, you have what's been added to it to show the school districts, and then you have the presentational aspect of the board that it's on. So it's a layered image, it's a layered thing in and of itself. And as I said, I do have, I think, a better explanation, or maybe two, that could explain possibly what this was created for. We'll circle back to that. But for now, let's get back to the program. And let's talk about what this actually is. Because I think in order to understand why this is unique, there's a lot of school districts here, right? And a lot of schoolhouses. Like this one in the town of Johnson. Yeah, we'll just run with it. Town of Johnson here. One-room schoolhouses, right? Rural schoolhouses. There's a lot of them. So what is this all? Let's step back and talk about what a school district is, because this is something that actually isn't a new phenomenon. Back in 1848, when Wisconsin became a state, the Constitution that we wrote to show that we're all organized and everything, we got everything planned out so that the United States would let us in from a territory to become a state. It actually creates school districts. Public school districts are part of the administrational structure that's created in the Constitution. And they basically say, there's like a statewide superintendent of schools that's created during this to kind of help coordinate and organize and all that sort of stuff and set standards. But the school districts themselves would be operated by the local level government. So your local village, your local township could create, merge, destroy school districts. They were responsible for building a building, hiring a teacher, maintaining everything, making sure that kids could and did go to school. These are all up to the local people. To help with this, they were given some ability to levy some taxes so that they could pay for everything from the community that they serve. But it's really rooted in the local. And so in many places, they would create a school. As people moved into the area, hey, it's time that we, have a closer school. So-and-so is willing to give some land on their property. We'll build a building. And it just kind of evolves from there. So to get a better idea of how this all breaks down and what it looks like by the time that map is created, I want to tell you about the school district directories. So they didn't necessarily do these every year. I'm not sure when they started. Our collection has one in 1922-24 and then there's a big gap, and then we start in the 40s, and then it goes through the 60s. But basically what this would be, even the gaps in there, it's still pretty useful as a resource because this has it's a directory, right? So you open it up and it has a listing of all of the school officers and teachers at all of the schools in the rural and I guess I should say the county with the exception of the cities. The and maybe sometimes the bigger villages as well. So like Wausau, Mosinee, and Colby, I think, are the three. Maybe Unity is in there too. No, Colby isn't included. Those are the three big cities, around, in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Some of the bigger villages sometimes get thrown in here, but really what we're looking at is the rural parts and smaller villages, the places that, operate kind of these sort of things. So for example, here is the first page here. Technically it's page 4, but 5, 6, 7. Town of Bergen, town of Berlin, it goes through it alphabetically. These are the rural schools. So we know that in the town of Bern, Beaver Creek School was in operation at that point, but Van Buren School was. And Mrs. Julia Voigt was the teacher. She lived on Route 1 in Athens. There were about 51 students enrolled back in 1946. They periodically did a school census. And then these are the officers that if you needed to get in touch, this is the clerk, the director, and the treasurer, and where they live. And so this is a great resource if you're trying to get your student, your child enrolled in a class. This is where you would go, right? And so it kept track of this as we continue to go. There's more and more. It lists all of the different junctions. And again, these are all one-room schoolhouses, rural schools. Now, one-room schoolhouse, I'm not going to get into specifically everything that went on there. That's kind of outside of my interest at the moment. We'll look at this in a bit. But basically, one-room schoolhouses, even though it's not necessarily literally one room, it would be basically a schoolhouse where there was one teacher. And that teacher could have a dozen to a couple dozen. I can't imagine, here, Mrs. Leonard McHugh in Ludington School in the town of Emmett up here, 245 students and one teacher. Yeah, that's kind of crazy, but that's how it worked, right? So you would have classes kind of doing simultaneously. You'd say, all right, you work on these lessons, and then I'm going to go to the older kids and get them started, and then we'll go back, and the older kids help the younger kids. It was sort of a communal effort. And that's the one-room schoolhouse, right? Rural, very locally based. But if you keep flipping, eventually you find the starting of graded schools. So town of Wien is the last rural, and then in page 27, you see the second-class state graded schools, and then the first class graded schools. So the difference there being a second class has 2 teachers instead of 1, and if you have 3 or more, then you become a first-class graded schools. And this is where the term grade school comes from. It's because it's not just everybody lumped into one building, it's graded. You have different sessions, different rooms for different grades. So for example, Schofield, they had a public school, and this would have been a first-class graded school. There's multiple teachers, multiple rooms, and so they operated out of this. Now, obviously, these are in areas that are going to be a little bit more populated. You're not going to necessarily get away with this when it's, 20, 30 students. You don't need multiple rooms. If you're only going a mile or 2 away, that's all you need. But in places like Schofield, for example, some of the areas around the greater Wausau area, Mosinee, you can see here, there's some places that are Wittenberg, Brokaw, places like that. They also had listings for high schools, although that was mainly because, like, for example, if you're in the town of Wien, there's no high school in the town of Wien, or Johnson, or Frankfurt, or wherever you're going to go. So if you want to go to high school, you're going to have to go to one of the villages, and so they do include Edgar, and Athens, and Marathon City, and Wausau, and, the places that had high schools at this point. But yeah, that's the basic idea. And yeah, so this is the sort of framework that we're working with. Towards the end of the 1800s, you start to see a little bit more standards. That's when you get like the graded schools being set up and sort of teaching certificates. That changes a lot too. When you get a normal school, which is a school for teachers. So we had one in Wausau for the county. There's one up in Merrill. There's one down in Stevens Point. There's, in major cities, the county seats, they would have usually one maintained by the county. And this allowed for training of teachers for all of these schools, which is good because there's a lot of schools, as you can see. And so we needed teachers. And so as the population grows, you have the ability to support multiple one-room schoolhouses all across the county, and you have teachers that can teach them. You see them go up and up, which is, I don't know if this is the highest point that we had, 212, but it's pretty close here in 1948. Now, as I said, there's a whole story about what it was like to go to school and all that sort of stuff. If you're interested in knowing more about that, we have some stuff on our website. We operate the Little Red Schoolhouse. The Historical Society does. It took over for the Altrusa Club, who got all that going up, for which we're thankful. And if you're like me, like I grew up in Wausau, I, in 4th grade, went to the Little Red Schoolhouse and got the whole experience. If you want to know more, we have that stuff on our website. There's also a video series that we did back in 2020 where we filmed some stuff. So if you want to go watch that, I put the link in the description. You can check that out afterwards. But I'm more interested in a different question. Not what it was like in these schools, but why don't we have them anymore? Because clearly, like if we go to what we have today, and I have to apologize, this is not actually current. I was basing this off a map that turned out to be made in 2001, but it's pretty close to what it had up until about, the big difference is Merrill no longer has this area. I think it's Athens. I don't know if there's others. But even if it's 2010, right? If this is accurate to 2010, this is basically what it looks like today. So how do we go from 212 districts to what turns out to be 17? Or if you don't count the ones that go over the county line, to places like Merrill or Medford or Marshfield, 9. That's a big difference. But even if it's 17, clearly something happened to consolidate all of those districts. So what is it? Well, my initial action, what I thought was going to be the answer here, and which is still very relevant, is the school bus. Wait, sorry. There you go. Got to get the right color there. So school buses are very important. We start to see the arrival of school buses back in the mid to late 30s. We see Athens. I found a couple of these. Athens, I want to say Hamburg and Frankfurt? One of those places. I found those 3. They all started their first school bus definitively in 1937 or 38. So I think in general, not everybody was doing this, but some of the districts were starting to, have a school bus for the kids that needed to get further away. As early as the late 30s, started to become pretty common. Of course, during World War II, 1941 to 45, we got to put that on hold because we have, gas rationing and, actually they close a lot of the schools because, labor shortages and, be more efficient. But after the war, we get to do this again. In particular, in 1949, the state mandates that every district in Wisconsin has to have a school bus, specifically to get high school kids to high schools. Because, and this isn't part of another reason why this all happens. Back in the turn of the century into the maybe 20s, right? Getting everybody through 8th grade, just basic elementary education, even like 5th, 6th grade, that would be a win. So having these decentralized schools and making sure that there were quality teachers that you could actually get through, that was great. Nobody really needed or was expected to go to high school. If you could, great. But you don't necessarily need to. In the same way that, you weren't expected to go to college in those days. You could certainly get by with an 8th grade education, support a family, have a happy life, and be part of a community. But by the middle of the century, there starts to be, that's good. Now, what about the higher education? It's not saying that everybody in 1949 is expected to have a high school diploma when the time that they graduate. Ideally, yeah, absolutely want everybody to do that. But the real thing is here, it's not so much that everybody needs to, but everybody should have the opportunity to. You shouldn't not be able to get a high school education just because you were born on a farm equidistant from all these places where you have to walk 9-10 miles to the nearest high school. So by mandating this and making sure that high school students can get to a high school, which again, weren't very decentralized, they're just in the big villages and the cities at this point, this kind of speeds things up. Because eventually the question becomes, well, if we're already maintaining buses and they're not terribly expensive to operate compared to like the cost of running a school, Well, what if we just also take the elementary school and middle school kids to a centralized place? So that's an explanation. These kind of things, the higher education expectation and also the ability to bus students being available and accepted kind of erodes the need for all of these one-room schoolhouses. Or so I thought. And this is where I dug into the history and found that there was actually attempts to try to do this back in the 19 teens. There was a convention here of the school district in 1914 in which A.A. Thompson, the state inspector of schools, comes and gives a talk to all of the officers and teachers in Marathon County. And he basically says, you should consolidate them. The state will help with the costs of maintaining a bigger building, a graded school. We'll help with the busing if we need to. Maybe not buses in 1914, but, transportation. And that falls on deaf ears. And it turns out there's a big complicated issue, but in part, the other big reason is the persistence, the big reason for the consolidation of the schools is the persistence of guys like George Watson, who is the superintendent of public schools, or depending on who you were asked, that power-hungry autocrat with a profound hatred for the local self-governance. So it turns out that consolidation of schools is a hot-button political issue. Who would have guessed that local politics and education could be derisive? But it was. There were people who really, really hated him because he was trying to take away their traditional way of life. Hey, one-room schoolhouses, the way we've been doing public school districts, it's worked for my generation where I grew up and my grandparents and even their grandparents. 50, 60 years we've been doing this. Why should we adopt some newfangled way that the state is trying to force on us? As it turns out, there's good reasons for this. And granted, it's not just George. Probably even greater credit goes to the work of John Callahan, who was his predecessor, who really sees this in the 20s and says, we got to do something, and really lays the groundwork and gets, there are a lot of rural school associations formed all over the state that vehemently, make it their life's goal to stop the government from changing the one-room schoolhouses. But the persistence pays off. And eventually, things like, for example, in 1950, you have a big sort of test case here. Weston, Schofield, Rothschild, and parts of Ringel incorporate their school districts into a new district down in the southeast here. This becomes a DC Everest. The Everest School District is still kind of county. It's still kind of serving a lot of rural areas, but they are able to build some pretty big graded schools and high school even. And this shows the efficiency, and that actually those students that go to the graded schools, not having to deal with one teacher who's teaching 200 kids or even like 30, just being able to teach and be trained in experience in how to teach first through second graders or third graders, or just sixth, not having to be able to do everything means that they can get a better product. And having all of the resources, and there's a lot of reasons that one-room schoolhouses are great, but there's a lot of reasons to change. And ultimately, time ends up catching up, and local administration people here in the government in Marathon County, as well as the rest of the state, despite the local resistance, we see the erosion of the public school system to be consolidated. So what's the evidence here? Well, I got a couple things. Remember these school directories I did? Well, I went through and I graphed them. So from 1941 to 1961, there's a couple gaps here, as you can see, but I went through and tracked the townships. These are for the rural schools. These are for the graded schools. Before I realized what I was doing, I was also throwing, if there's, like, for example, the town of Cronenwetter and the town of Mosinee, they both also have a graded school, so I just kind of put their number up on the top there. But overall, we can kind of get a sense of each municipality, how many schools are they dealing with. There's also high schools, but those don't really change very much. So we're mostly interested in this. Now I added colors to kind of graphically show this. So red means there's no school. Orange means there's one school in the whole, usually township. And then yellow is 2 or 3. And as you can see, there's a pretty clear trend. Starting in the 50s, particularly here with, again, Ringel, Weston, and then Schofield and Rothschild consolidating. By the mid 50s, late 50s, you start to see this change pretty considerably. And by the time that we get to 1961, 62, actually 63, this is the directory for 63, 64, which doesn't list town by town, village by village, but just has basically this. And this section here tells you where the districts are. Athens, Edgar, Marathon, Spencer, and Stratford, and that's considered the county area. And then there's Everest. Again, they're not counting Wausau, they're not counting Mosinee or Colby. I think those are kind of the big three. But and also the ones that are being, bussed over to Medford or Marshfield or places like that. Yeah, by 1963, it's pretty much complete. Now, they might have multiple schools within that district. It's not just one school per district like it mostly was before. But yeah, by the 1960s, pretty much the one-room schoolhouse is a thing of the past. And so that's how that whole process shakes out. And that's leads us back to this map. I said that there are some other alternatives here. Now, one reason that this might have been created might have been for the state of Wisconsin's centennial. In 1948, it had been 100 years of the state of Wisconsin, and so maybe as part of the plans, someone put this together. Let's call that an edge case. I don't think that that's as likely, but it's possible. But the thing that I think this is more likely for is, and again, or maybe I just want to talk about it. It's maybe not more likely, but I'm going to say it is for the sake of this. In 1949, so the following year, the Wausau Daily Record-Herald does a school survey from, let's see here, I wrote it down, starting in February and going through July, every week or a couple times a week, their issue would include a photograph of a one-room schoolhouse and the students there. These are the 5 that that were included from the town of Johnson. Notably, there were 6 in the town of Johnson, so they didn't do every single district. And maybe that's partially because they had been consolidated during this period. I'm not entirely sure about the timeline. I didn't go that deeply. But these are the ones and the dates that they were published. And so these are the school kids in these schools. So, Lad School on the April 15th. Here are all of the students. Here's their names. And this is just a fun way to going out in the community and documenting, because I think that they understood, this sort of small class and this is the school, that's maybe on the way out. Even in 1948, 49, they ended up taking pictures as well of the school buildings. And I should tell you specifically, the negatives ended up getting donated, in the prints, were donated from the Herald to the Historical Society at some point. And then, in particular, a number of people came in. Shout out to Thomas Becker. Put a lot of time to consolidate all of this information into a concise history of the school district. That was in the early 2000s. And so between this, again, it's not completely comprehensive. They did 112 schools that were published during this period, as opposed to some 200 that there should be. But I wouldn't be surprised if this was created by somebody so that the Daily Herald knew where they were going to go, so they could kind of get a sense of where things were, and so they could get the big ones. Again, who knows? I could be wrong. I will say that through my research, the consolidation has kind of started in some places. If this was actually the school year 48, 49, there are a couple of these districts that would not be this way. So, and I don't have 47, 48, because calendar year is different than school year, so it's hard to know. I'm guessing this is 47, 48, in which case, I don't know, it's close enough. It's pretty similar to 46, 45, kind of the post-war era, but still kind of, I would say the last, I don't know if this is the biggest or the most split up the county has ever been. It's possible there were more districts, in the 1930s or something, but certainly this is the last time and the sort of high point, the zenith, just before the consolidation really takes hold. And for that reason, it's a very cool map. Part of me wishes that they had done this more often. It's a lot of work, but it'd be very cool to see this over the years. What did it look like 5 years later or 10 years later or 20 years earlier. But it is, to my knowledge, just a one-off, which is also very cool, and we can learn a lot of cool things about it. So yeah, that's the program that I have ready here. Um, I hope that you enjoyed it, as always. Again, we're going to be continuing some history of maps going forward for the next few weeks, starting next week with the let's see, bring this up again. Topographical maps from Gary Gisselman back, and then I'm going to be doing a railroad map to round out the month. I'm going to check to see if there's any comments or questions in the chat live here, and then yeah, let you go. But just see, you never know. Okay. I'm not seeing any, but it's all right. Yeah, it doesn't look like there are any live, but that's all right. Again, I'll just kind of stall for a second here, just on the off chance that maybe someone's typing. But yeah, I hope you're enjoying the March MAPness. This is a lot of fun to take a map and tell a story with it. I hope that it's a fun format. We'll explore some stuff coming up with different formats, but hopefully it's a good one. All right. Well, I think we maybe hit that point where we call it a day. So I will just say again, thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll see you again in the future. And again, happy St. Patrick's Day if you're watching this the day of. And I guess also if you're not, that's fine too. Just in retrospectively. Anyway, I'm going to end this. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.